These are some of the hardest weapons to get in Elden Ring. They have some of the lowest chances to drop, but there's a good reason why you'll want to still farm them. They deal great damage, look really cool, and have unique movesets that can definitely help a ton when dealing with tough enemies. That's why today we'll take a look at 5 more super rare weapons that you don't want to miss out on in Elden Ring, so let's begin. Coming up at number 5, we have the extremely rare Lazuli Glenstone sword that drops from the Lazuli sorcerers, the ones with the strange helmets, shields, and weapons in their hands. You can find 3 of these very close to the Karya Manor upper level side of Grace, very close to one of these giants, so you can go ahead and farm them right there. Don't be fooled by the poor intelligence scaling though, this weapon is actually really strong. So the weapon skill on it is called the Glenstone Pebble, and as you may or may not know, this is one of the best in terms of interrupting and stunning any enemy in Elden Ring in just a few shots. The Glenstone Pebble, if you combine this with a follow-up on the R2, you can easily deal over 2k damage even with a build that doesn't really invest anything into physical damage. So that's actually quite good for a hybrid or a mage that doesn't have any mana left but still wants to deal damage or maybe a stun. What makes this weapon super unique is its heavy attack. You can start with the sword in a parry position in front of your character's face, immediately followed by a powerful strike, which actually comes in with a ton of benefits, one of which being the fact that that initial weapon parry actually does behave like a real parry and will block incoming attacks, reduce that damage, but at the same time also not get you interrupted in the middle of the attack. So you have a bit more freedom of when to use the heavy attack without being punished as much, mitigate a good chunk of damage assuming that you still have the stamina left, and then unleash the final blow when the enemy is in its weakest state following his own attack. So I'd say that makes it pretty awesome. The next one at number 4 is the Noble Slander Sword, one of the most rare drops in Elden Ring, at just 0.5% chance to drop from the common noble enemies that are quite abundant around Limgrave. An easy early group can be found patrolling with the troll caravan starting next to the waypoint ruins right here on this side of the map, and you'll find about 3 or 4 of these enemies that already kinda come with the group, but they also have the sword and as a result can also drop it. Now these have some really low stat requirements in strength and dexterity, which means you can build it around almost with any hybrid or non-hybrid build. But my favorite by far has to be with the Ash of War Square Off that comes by default with it. Since it's so powerful, I use it by default and then combine it with a High Faith Holy Paladin build that makes use of the Order's Blade, but literally any other weapon enchant will work just as well. Now Square Off is an amazing overlooked weapon skill that lets you alter your normal and heavy attacks if you start with an L2 first. So for example, if you combine the L2 with a heavy, this will deal a very high damage stab that has a pretty short cast animation, barely consumes mana, and has a pretty nice reach. Meanwhile, if you use the L2 plus R1 normal, you can do this very high slash damage that also deals very good poise damage against the target. So you can either combine these with one another or just repeat that L2 plus R1, which if you spam it, it will likely stun almost any enemy in just a few shots. In fact, Square Off is so good with the Noble Sword that is likely something you'll constantly use without ever having to rely or touch the normal or the normal heavy attacks with this weapon, since you deal so much more damage with the Square Off. Moving on to number 3, the next one is going to be the Executioner's Great Axe. It's a slightly better drop chance than the previous 2 weapons, but still a pretty rare drop nonetheless. Now you can find this from the skeletons in the graveyard just west of the lake facing cliff side of Grace after passing the Church of Aerith nearby and making your way over there. But this is a really great strength weapon that already has really high base attack rating, and if you put a heavy affinity on it, it also reaches a scaling in strength strength, so you likely want to like play with this with a strength build and easily reach that 1k attack rating with the weapon. But if you combine this with a lightning slash Ash of War, you're literally getting the Dragon Slayer Great Axe, and I mean, just look at the weapon itself, it kinda already looks like a rustic version of that, so I would say it's pretty close. Obviously you can infuse it with any other Ash of War and affinity, but I really like this one with the lightning slash even on a strength build like this, and even if I'm not making use of any dexterity. Reason being is because you can deal this very high damage, it's pretty fast. You also have the second kind of like lightning strike that also interrupts enemies, so you can then follow up with a second lightning slash again and just use this constantly against your targets. Oh, and by the way, it seems to do an easy job at stunning enemies, especially in terms of dragons. I'm not sure if there's any hidden effect or hidden references to the version from Dark Souls 3. Maybe it is, let me know down below in the comments, but against dragons it definitely seems to like easily stun them in just like 3 hits. Moving on to number 2, the next one is the Omen cleaver, dropped from the Omen enemies you see using this weapon, and there's a couple of spots you can find them in. The earliest being the left side chamber in Stormveil Castle. There's one really close to the side of Grace and comes in much earlier, but you can also find a couple more in the subterranean shunning grounds in the royal capital, but of course much later in the game. Now this is another excellent weapon for strength builds, especially with a Lion's Claw, Ash of War and a heavy affinity. Using it like this will likely stun anything in just 2 lion claws, and if not, will still provide excellent damage with a few ways to get interrupted. But as I've said, there's also a few unique aspects about it, one of which being the fact that it seems to share the same unique R2 guillotine type of attack with the Magma Worm Scale Sword. So if you two-hand this weapon, your heavy and jump heavy attacks will perform a guillotine sort of attack where you hold your sword horizontally for more damage but lower reach. This likely makes it one of the fastest charged R2 attacks of all great swords and possibly many of the other heavy weapons in Elden Ring, so you can spam it a lot more than some of the other options in the game, and you can also follow up with a second or subsequent R2s which are even faster than the first ones, but obviously R1 is still very fast with the normal attack on the Omen cleaver too. And finally, coming up to number 1, last but definitely not least, is the Guardian Sword Spear, dropped by the Earth Tree Guardian enemies, and I recommend farming the 10 or so that you can find on the branch from the West Capital Rampart in Lindell as you make your way to the nearby Golden Shade boss fight. This one is one of the most unique, kinda like halberds in terms of how it uses its normal attacks, which include a series of diagonal uppercut cuts with the normal one instead of the regular pokes and slashes that other halberds have. It's pretty similar to Loretta's War Sickle in fact, which has about the same movesets, but it does have some other benefits. Of course, you also have a poke with it in terms of the running plus R1, but you're kinda losing on the other attacks, which are usually just slashes, especially the jump heavies. But pressing R1 lets you do these relatively fast R1s that are also great at breaking defenses, so if you go against enemies with shields, you'll oftentimes see them getting stunned or staggered, and you can follow up with a critical. More important though, you can combine this with a sword dance Ash of War, also put any like affinity on it as you see fit, and what you will get is a very fast, long-reaching, high damage weapon that also does a great job at interrupting most enemies, especially with the first part of the slash. With it, you can choose to either go full dexterity and put a blood affinity on it, which will give you about 101 blood loss, or maybe invest a few more points into faith, just enough to cast Blood Flame Blade and then use a non-magic affinity on it to buff it that way, or with any other type of weapon enchant. It will transform this into a very fun weapon that also has one of the strongest attacks in Elden Ring, so I guess it's totally worth it. Totally let me know down below in the comments which one of these was your favorite. As always, if you enjoyed this video at any point, a thumbs up on it would be super appreciated, and if you really enjoyed it, then also make sure you subscribe and activate that notification bell, and I'll see you guys in the next one.